Most people were taught that World War I ended with the signing of a document inside the Hall of Mirrors. You were told that the Treaty of Versailles was a diplomatic masterpiece designed to bring lasting peace to a shattered European continent. On the surface, the story is simple, and it feels like justice. The Allied powers, representing freedom and democracy, punished the German Empire for the catastrophic devastation of a 4-year war. But if you bypass the history books and open the old ledger books, the narrative completely changes. Behind the patriotic speeches, the diplomatic handshakes, and the red borders drawn on the maps, a much colder and far more cynical game was being played. The Treaty of Versailles was not primarily a treaty of peace. It was the largest, most ruthless debt collection mechanism ever constructed. It was a financial instrument designed to extract wealth from a collapsing nation, simply to pay off an impossible wartime credit line. Who really forced Germany to pay a penalty so massive that it broke the back of an entire society? And more importantly, where did that river of money actually go? To understand the true origins of the next global catastrophe, we have to look past the battlefields. We have to step inside the banking houses, the private syndicates, and the sovereign debt accounts of the victorious empires. In the summer of 1919, the streets of London and Paris were filled with cheering crowds and waving flags. The Allied empires had survived, and the Great War was finally over. But behind the heavy wooden doors of their respective treasury departments, the mood was one of quiet, terrifying panic. Britain and France were victorious on paper, but functionally, they were completely bankrupt. 4 years of brutal trench warfare, artillery production, and naval blockades had drained their national gold reserves to the absolute bottom. To keep their massive military machines running, they had been forced to survive on a massive, international credit card. By the end of the war, the Allied powers had borrowed billions of dollars, mostly from Wall Street syndicates and private American banking institutions, led by J.P. Morgan. London, which had been the undisputed financial capital of the world, was suddenly drowning in foreign debt. The war had stopped, but the short-term loans were coming due, and the interest was compounding. The British and French empires were bleeding cash at an unprecedented rate, and their own exhausted taxpayers could not possibly cover the deficit. They were backed into a financial corner, facing the very real threat of a sovereign default. They needed a massive injection of liquidity, and they needed it immediately, to avoid collapsing under the weight of their American loans. The solution to this unprecedented financial crisis was not found in domestic economic reform. It was found in the ink of a diplomatic treaty aimed directly at the defeated enemy. The textbook version of history often claims that France and Britain demanded extreme reparations from Germany purely out of revenge. They wanted to punish the aggressor and make them pay for the physical destruction of French soil. But the missing chapter of this story is the transatlantic debt loop. The Allied leaders were not just seeking moral justice, they were desperate for cash flow. Across the ocean, Washington and the Wall Street bankers were heavily pressuring London and Paris to begin servicing their war bonds. Without a massive influx of foreign capital, the British and French economies would simply collapse. So, the architects of the treaty turned the defeated German nation into an emergency financial collateral. The Treaty of Versailles was an accounting maneuver, disguised as diplomacy. The underlying logic was brutal, but simple. The money was supposed to flow out of the shattered German economy into the vaults of London and Paris, and then immediately cross the Atlantic to pay off the American bankers. Germany was not just signing a document acknowledging military defeat. It was being forced to sign the largest promissory note in human history. The entire map of Europe was effectively being held hostage by a balance sheet. The victors were using a broken nation as a financial conduit to save their own empires from bankruptcy. Inside the grand treaty rooms of Versailles, the air was thick with cigar smoke, national pride, and financial desperation. The Big Four leaders, along with their armies of bankers and economic advisors, hovered over map tables, calculating the exact price of a fallen empire. The final reparations bill handed to Germany was staggering and completely detached from reality. 132 billion gold marks. This was roughly equivalent to over $31 billion at the time, a sum that no economy on earth could actually produce. Top economic minds inside the British delegation including the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, looked at this number in absolute horror. Keynes explicitly warned the treaty makers that extracting this much capital was an impossible math equation. He argued that squeezing Germany for this amount would not only destroy the German economy, but it would inevitably drag the rest of Europe down with it. He eventually resigned in disgust, calling the treaty a Carthaginian peace. But inside that locked room, the financial warnings were completely ignored. The politicians needed an astronomically high number on paper to satisfy the anger of their voters back home, and to prove to their international creditors that they had a plan to pay their debts. It did not matter to them if the debt was actually repayable in the real world. What mattered was that the Allied balance sheets showed a massive incoming revenue stream. They forced the German delegation to sign the treaty under the threat of military occupation. They knew perfectly well that Germany did not have the gold, the exports, or the industrial capacity to meet the payment schedule. A financial time bomb had just been planted directly into the foundation of the new Weimar Republic. When a treaty forces a nation to pay a debt it cannot afford, the bill is never paid by the politicians. It is eventually handed down to the ordinary citizens, who had no say in the war and no seat at the negotiation table. By 1923, Germany had run out of gold and defaulted on its coal and timber shipments to France. In response, French and Belgian troops marched across the border and occupied the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of Germany, to extract the debt payments by force. To support the striking workers in the Ruhr, and to meet the impossible demands for foreign currency, the German government had only one desperate option left. They turned on the printing presses, and they never turned them off. What followed was the catastrophic hyperinflation of 1923, an economic disaster that wiped out an entire society. The value of the German mark did not just drop, it completely vaporized. Life inside the Weimar Republic devolved into a daily, exhausting financial nightmare. Prices doubled every few days, and soon they were doubling every few hours. People carried their weekly wages in wheelbarrows, rushing to the bakeries to buy a single loaf of bread before the currency lost its value by the afternoon. Middle-class families, who had worked their entire lives, watched their savings accounts, their pensions, and their futures disappear in a matter of weeks. Children played with blocks of worthless cash in the muddy streets because millions of paper marks were cheaper than wooden toys. Women burned stacks of currency in their kitchen stoves just to keep their homes warm in the winter because the paper was cheaper than buying firewood. The Treaty of Versailles did not just bankrupt a government. It erased the wealth, the dignity, and the fundamental stability of an entire generation. And when you wipe out the savings of a society using an invisible financial weapon, you create a very dangerous psychological void. You create a fertile, desperate breeding ground for radical extremism. In the dark, smoke-filled beer halls of Munich, a frustrated and starving population was looking for someone to blame for their financial ruin. They were looking for a savior who could explain why their money was worthless and why their country was being humiliated. An unknown former corporal began giving passionate speeches to these angry crowds. He did not just talk about military pride or racial purity at first. He promised to tear up the Versailles debt papers. He promised to break the chains of international finance and stop the flow of German wealth to foreign bankers. The catastrophic economic pain, directly caused by a ruthless, impossible debt settlement, became the very fuel for the rise of the Nazi Party. The financial collapse created the desperation, and the desperation welcomed the dictator. History often remembers the men who signed the treaties and the generals who fought the battles. But the real bill is always paid by the people who were never invited into the room. The Treaty of Versailles was disguised to the public as a diplomatic triumph, a necessary step to secure global peace. But at its core, if you follow the paper trail, it was a desperate banking deal. It was a reckless attempt to solve a massive sovereign credit crisis by squeezing a defeated nation until it broke. It did not create a lasting peace. It created a vicious, transatlantic debt loop that pushed an entire society to the absolute edge of madness. A political decision is rarely made in a vacuum. It is often born from a budget crisis, a credit shortage, or the need to satisfy a silent creditor. And the true invoice of World War I was never actually settled with gold. It was settled 2 decades later with the blood of World War II. Do you think World War II was born entirely from radical ideology and the ambition of one man? Or was it the inevitable, catastrophic result of a broken balance sheet drawn up in a room in Paris? Tell me what you think in the comments below.